Good morning, good afternoon even. My name is Russell Keir and I'm a committee member of the IOSH Railway Group. Hopefully joining me at some time will be Edward Hodgson, who is also a member of the committee. And I'm broadcasting from my conservatory in Paisley this morning. It's raining, which is really unusual for this time of year in the west of Scotland. This is the sixth and final presentation of the IOSH Railway Group conference. And we've previously heard from Ian Prosser, Director of Railway Safety at ORR, who was talking about the challenges of COVID-19 and beyond. Anne Mills, Professional Head of Health and Safety and Wellbeing at the Railway Safety and Standards Board, who was introducing the rail industry's health and safety strategy, collaboration in the making. Nick Millington, Safety Task Force Director, Network Rail, who was talking about track worker safety. George Bearfield, Director of Health and Safety at Rock Rail Holdings Limited, and he talked about safe and secure digital assets. And just this morning, we heard from Simon French, Chief Inspector of Railways for the Railway Accident Investigation Branch, who spoke about investigating the accidents before it happened. Today's talk is Learning from Ladbroke Grove by Mr. Greg Morse. This presentation should be a welcome reminder to organisations' corporate memory and should help organisations remember and learn from the tragic incident. I have known Greg for many years, and I've always found his presentations to be most informative and very enjoyable. Unfortunately, Greg cannot be here in person today. However, Greg has provided a recorded presentation, and any questions for Greg will be passed on to him. A little bit about Greg. Greg has been in the rail industry for at least 15 years and is an author of various books and articles. He is the editor of the Railway Safety Standards Board's publication Leading Health and Safety on Britain's Railways and is RSSB's operational feedback lead. He is a member of the Institute of Railway Operations and he is returning to the editor's chair of the Right Track magazine. So all going well, technology's in place, and we can hear from Greg now. Thank you.
Essentially what I do at RSSB, have done for the last decade or so, as some of you will know, is deal with learning from accidents. Accidents and operational experience to give it its wider remit. And some of the lessons that we have learned in the past are receding further and further into the past. And that means that they then start to come under the banner of corporate memory, which is essentially stuff we need to hang on to for a bit longer yet. And that's what the focus of today's presentation is going to be about. So I'm going to try to share my screen with you. Do shout if this doesn't work, because I'm not really amazing at all. So if we owe it to people affected by the accidents of our past, we also owe it to people like this woman. This is Pam Warren. On October the 5th, 1999, she was travelling on a train into London. Just after 08:05, another train left Paddington bound for Bedwin. Its driver passed Sierra November 109 signal at danger. Its driver, Michael Hodder, had passed a double yellow and a single yellow beforehand, acknowledging the AWS twice, acknowledging it a third time before striking the HST on which Pam was travelling. 31 people, including both drivers, were killed. Hundreds more were injured, including Pam, who was in a coma for 3 weeks and whose severe burns required her to wear a Perspex shield to minimise facial scarring, as you can see here. She became known as the Lady in the Mask and went on to found the Paddington Survivors Group, becoming a spokesperson and advocate for railway safety. And more than once did she ask us what we were doing to stop more people being killed or maimed like her. The immediate cause of the Ladbroke Grove accident was, of course, a SPAD. On the face of it, our industry had been very active in dealing with SPADs. Indeed, the origins of train protection came out of a fatal SPAD and collision that occurred at Slough as far back as 1900. We needn't pore over the details today. We do have a train protection digest, which I can share with you later on. But the investigation revealed that perhaps the most disturbing thing about it was not that the driver hadn't obeyed the signals, but that he couldn't remember why. Part of the first Great Western's reaction was to develop this apparatus that would sound a bell in the cab if a distant signal was clear and a siren if it was at caution. This recognised that as trains were getting faster, distant signals were becoming more important as they gave drivers more time to slow for a stop signal up ahead. Trialled on the Henley branch in 1906, the equipment was later developed so that if a driver passed a caution and failed to acknowledge the warning, the brakes would automatically apply. In this form, what became known as automatic train control would be fitted to over 3,000 locomotives and nearly 3,000 Great Western track miles by 1939, and would contribute a great deal to that company's excellent safety record. Indeed, it'd be the forerunner of every train protection system that came after, including AWS, although this was more heavily based on a similar London, Midland and Scottish railway system. Either way, in one of the bitter ironies of railway safety, British Railways was developing AWS just as the terrible multi-SPAD double collision occurred at Harrow and Wealdstone in 1952. Claiming 112 lives, it was second only to the Quintinshill disaster in terms of fatalities. AWS had been installed between King's Cross and Grantham by 1956. By 1960, it reached York and would go on to reduce the SPAD rate and SPAD risk enormously. At least it did when it worked. And the fact that it didn't was in the causal chain of the accident at Southall, which came just 2 years before Ladbroke Grove. At around 13:10 on Friday the 19th of September 1997, driver Larry Harrison started packing up his holdall with his diagram and notices. Rounding the left-hander ahead of Southall, he suddenly saw a red signal ahead. As the lines straightened in front of him, he saw a 59 at what he'd later describe as a funny angle. A collision was inevitable. He rammed on the brake. He knew there was nothing more he could do. He left his seat and hid behind the bulkhead door. By the time he emerged again, his train would be in disarray. 6 people would be dead, with another soon to follow, and 139 would be injured. By 7 that evening, he'd be arrested. There was soon speculation about Harrison after it was reported that he'd been spotted pulling into Bristol Parkway with both feet on the driving desk. The problem for him was that while his record was good and blemished by a couple of slow-speed SPADs in the 70s and an incident in 1996 when he'd set off without the right of way, he had not only passed Sierra November 254 at red, but had also unheeded the single and double yellow in the run-up. By the time he'd been charged with manslaughter the following April, Professor Uff's public inquiry had begun. By the time that had been published, this second accident led to a joint report to Train Protection Systems headed by Uff and Lord Cullen, who was leading the latter inquiry. AWS had since been joined on the Great Western Main Line and Chiltern lines out of Marylebone by Automatic Train Protection, which was based on the European systems, which had been spurred by SPADs like those at Purley and Belgrove in 1989, and which automatically served to restrict the speed of a train on the approach to a signal at danger. At Southall, Harrison's inattention coupled up with faulty AWS on the leading power car and non-functioning ATP because Harrison wasn't qualified to use it. At Ladbroke Grove, Hodder's train, the turbo, would have been stopped had it been fitted like the HST involved in that event with ATP. But it wasn't. ATP installation within 10 years had in fact been recommended by Hidden in his report on the Clapham accident of 1988. But Hidden had also recommended the government and BR, quote, conduct a thorough review of investment appraisal procedures so that a financial value could be put on safety. Thus, in 1994, BR carried out a cost-benefit analysis of the whole project. This showed that a cost per equivalent fatality avoided of £13.9 million based on a full fitment cost of £475 million. As this was way above the level seen as justified by both the Health and Safety Executive and the government, ATP was ruled out, leaving its 2 pilot schemes somewhat stranded. I fear that the moral here is be careful what you wish for, perhaps. But while the trial sections remained in place, Uff Cullen's report, published in January 2001, considered both AWS and ATP to represent old technology anyway. As a result of other systems now being developed, it went on, there is no longer any serious demand for general fitment of ATP. One of those other systems was, of course, what you can see here, the Train Protection and Warning System, TPWS, which had been conceived as a development of AWS after it had been concluded that nationwide ATP installation was not, as we saw, and as we call it, reasonably practicable. TPWS was cheaper than ATP, but like ATP, improved on AWS by automatically applying the brakes on a train that had passed a fitted signal of danger or was approaching one too fast. Successful trials led to wide-scale installation from 2000. At the time, concerns mainly related to its perceived lack of effectiveness at speeds over 70 miles an hour. But though it would slow a train significantly, the system was later improved, TPWS Plus, as the graphic demonstrated, to incorporate additional overspeed sensors, thereby making it effective up to 100 miles an hour. TPWS, of course, is now well established and has played a large part in cutting the numbers of SPADs from around 500 a year to around 350, the vast majority totally benign on a railway that's getting ever busier. Yet, while SPADs are now relatively low in frequency, one occasionally still has the potential for high consequence loss. With this in mind, an industry-wide steering group has reviewed UFCullen to consider whether TPWS has reduced the risk as far as reasonably practicable, to look at whether other solutions can instead be adopted and whether there are better ways of sharing best practice. At the same time, RSSB continues to look at accidents caused by SPADs overseas to check whether they could happen here. The answer is usually no, but not always. Train protection, of course, is just one part of the whole SPAD issue, and certainly Cullen's report on Ladbroke Grove highlighted a veritable web of causation. First, the approaches to Paddington had been re-signalled for bidirectional working by BR in the early 90s. Many new signal heads were required, but as space was at a premium, most were mounted on gantries. The trouble was, the curvature of the formation meant it wasn't always obvious to an approaching driver which one was for which line. Reflective line identification signs had been added, but they were closer to the signal to the right than the signal for the line they related to. At the time of the accident, all the signals on the gantry that held Sierra November 109, gantry 8, were red, but the overhead line equipment for the new Heathrow Express service, which had been put in with scant regard to signal sighting, also created a situation in which, in fact, the signal was the last of all those on gantry 8 to become clearly visible to the driver of a train approaching from Paddington. It was argued that Michael Hodder, our turbo driver, had not received adequate training. BR's formal course for footplate staff, known as MP12, had begun as far back in 1973. This remained in use until superseded by the Modular Driver 2000 programme in 1992. In Beyond Hidden Dangers, which you can see there and is a book I recommend to you, Stanley Hall argued that Hodder's training was only loosely based on the BR system and included 4 weeks traction training and 16 weeks practical handling. Cullen revealed that the modified version of Drive 2000 handed over to Thames Trains in 1994 was indeed not being strictly followed by 98. And as you can see, Halcrow Transmark was later commissioned to examine the situation and noted that signalling maps and plans were available for some routes but had not been updated with essential information like multi-SPAD signals and so on. Furthermore, route learning norms did not appear to recognise the risk of inexperience, particularly for newly qualified drivers with no previous operating experience over the route. Hodder had started training on the 1st of February 1999. His first solo shift was on the 22nd of September, 33 weeks later, some 10 weeks less than the BR minimum. Although his trainer had taught him that Paddington was quote-unquote tricky, that he should count the signals from left to right to work out which one applied to his line, and that there had been problems with gantry 8. The trainer told the inquiry that he was not there to teach routes, but how to drive a turbo. The trainer, of course, had grown up with the system and had taken it as it evolved. Someone like Hodder was just thrown in at the deep end, in the trainer's own words. But until this evidence was given, the training manager had been unaware that the trainer did not think it for him to be teaching route knowledge. So there was a gap there. Now, Hodder and his trainer may not have known that Sierra November 109 was a multi-SPAD signal, but his company, the operator, hadn't helped them to know it either, a bigger gap. Indeed, there was something of a problem with the infrastructure manager on this point too. No one, in fact, was taking that holistic view. If there had been a number of Claphams in the making before Clapham, as the hidden report revealed that there had been, there were a number of potential Ladbroke Groves before Ladbroke Grove too. In fact, between the 1st of February 93 and the 2nd of July 99, there had been 67 SPADs in the Paddington area, and it got worse after the OLE went in. The layout had been conceived with the use of ATP in mind to provide collision prevention and safety. But ATP was only fitted to Great Western HSTs, and most of the SPADs involved Thames turbos. On the 10th of November 1995, indeed, a turbo passed Royal Oak's Sierra November 74 signal at danger and struck a Great Western HST. The driver of the former had read the wrong signal on gantry 5 that time. Only one person was injured, but the resulting report noted that the methods of route learning into and out of Paddington appeared very informal. It also noted that of the total of 37 SPADs in the Paddington area at that point, 21 had occurred at gantries, including 12 where the driver had mistaken the correct signal. On the 4th of February 1998, an HST did pass Sierra November 109 at danger, its driver misunderstanding a route indication received at the previous signal. When he realised he wasn't going down the down main, he threw out the anchors, but still exceeded the signal by over 400 yards. He stopped short of the fouling point, so a collision with an incoming train did not occur, but it was the 6th SPAD at Sierra November 109. There were to be 2 more before Ladbroke Grove. Issues of sighting, of layout, of confusion kept coming up. The data was there, the recommendations kept flowing, but they all seemed to fall into an administrative black hole. No one at Railtrack's Great Western Zone seemed to take responsibility or be given it. Indeed, to quote Cullen, the zone had no procedure for handling recommendations. There was also, perhaps more damningly, a culture of apathy and a lack of will to follow up promised actions. The only person who seemed to be putting all this together was Allison Foster, First Great Western's then Director of Operations and Safety. Time and time again, she voiced her concern about SPADs in the Paddington area. Time and time again, she urged Railtrack to take action. Time and time again, she attended meetings where there were plenty of ideas, but no subsequent actions. She told of a lack of clarity about who at Railtrack was meant to be dealing with SPADs. She told of how in August 1998, she'd written to Railtrack's production manager about Sierra November 109, asking as a matter of urgency what he intended to do about this high-risk signal. She never received a full response. For Forster, Railtrack did not look very often at some of the big picture issues. They tended to be reactive to incidents. They did not seem to be a learning organisation. Cullen's own recommendations, that's 40 and 55 if you want to look them up afterwards, and you can, incidentally, on the excellent Railways Archive website, which I also recommend, would advocate such a learning organisation to wit an independent body to set standards, accredit production and service suppliers, establish and manage system authorities, fund and sponsor research and development, monitor safety performance, share good practice and provide safety leadership. These functions were largely being addressed by Railtrack's Safety and Standards Directorate. By the time Cullen appeared, it had become more politically acceptable to separate them. Thus, Railway Safety and ultimately RSSB came into being. Although Safety and Standards Directorate does still exist in one of our shared drives at RSSB. So the baton of safety has been carried on, you might say. And the overarching lesson of Ladbroke Grove is that change increases risk, or can do. And here's the famous Swiss cheese model. Change the driver training, change the signal layout, change your structure, and if you haven't handled it properly, your failings could line up in the form of an accident. The trajectory of opportunity, as Reason described it. We know all this, of course, but we also know the industry can never afford to be complacent. Though Cullen said the current signal sighting standard needed replacing or revising, and though it was and has been several times since, recent RSSB analysis has shown that new signalling schemes can still contribute to SPADs. So though can new traction, it being found that the rheostatic brakes on some new stock can be impaired by using the driver reminder appliance on the move. So though can new timetables when they impact on driver workload and lead to the sorts of fatigue and concentration related issues we could all do without. More recent analysis still found no single cause for this rise, and a deep dive has been launched to try to really get to the bottom of these causes. Now, RSSB's original work was based on a small sample size, but the underlying causes we know about at the moment suggest that the industry should consider reviewing its SPAD risk management strategies whenever a change is made. Tpws, of course, can help in these situations. While too late for Ladbroke Grove, it undoubtedly has helped reduce SPAD risk to a much lower level, but it is not fail-safe, does not offer ceiling speed supervision, can't regulate a train speed on the approach to a red signal, and doesn't always guarantee that a train will stop in the overlap. And as the SPAD and near miss at Wootton Bassett Junction in March 2015 showed, its technology can also be overridden by the human element. Cullen inquiry had supported TPWS, but had seen it as an interim solution, pending the introduction of the European Train Control System, which provides ATP functionality and which they were told could be rolled out from around 2008. Yet wider ETCS implementation still hasn't happened. It's there on the Thameslink core section, it's there on the Cambrian, although not without software issues, as RAIB has recently explained. That's a report I'd recommend as well. But it is expensive, requires government backing, and governments seldom take the long-term view of infrastructure assets, anything at all, really. Now, obviously, when I wrote that line, we hadn't had the COVID situation, but there are plenty of examples in our history of governments offering money and then taking it away. And in fact, the original plan to develop AWS that I mentioned several minutes ago in relation to Harrow and Wilson accident, that had been a big project for the British Transport Commission, which took control of transport on nationalisation in 1948. And they were quite gung-ho about it and very keen to set the ball in motion. And then they found out that they didn't quite have enough money. So railway history is filled with booms and slumps financially. So just because we seemed to be attracting investment one year with one administration doesn't necessarily follow that the next administration will let us carry on. Since Cullen, since Ladbroke Grove, other train protection systems have emerged or have reached maturity. Monitoring has improved, of course, cab design has improved, signal sighting has improved, and more 3D technology is being used with that now. Our whole understanding of human factors has increased exponentially. Since Ladbroke Grove, there hasn't been a fatal collision resulting from a SPAD. The trouble is that Ladbroke Grove is now, like Clapham, part of our corporate memory, and as more and more of our people retire, and as more and more new people come in to replace them, what we learned, what we changed for the better, and how and why we did so, risk fading and vanishing unless we make an effort to remember. You may have heard me discuss books like Red for Danger before, and it was and is a vital corporate memory aid, but so is Hidden, so is Cullen, so is UF. Indeed, RAIB found Hidden vital in its recent investigations into the related low-speed collision at Waterloo and the signalling irregularity at Cardiff East Junction, as you can see on the screen there. In their turn, of course, RAIB's own investigation reports are a vital source of corporate knowledge too. And it's a default setting with many of us. We've had a SPAD, a derailment, a collision that reminds me of X. What did RAIB say about it? What did the Railway Inspector say about it? Looking at the older report is always the best starting point for the writing of the new. They're great tools to help us answer that question that Pam posed us right at the beginning. What are we doing to stop people being killed or injured? Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it useful and interesting. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I'm happy to take any questions if that pleases you too. Thank you very much.
Well, I always find Greg's presentations incredibly interesting and very knowledgeable. And I'm looking at the question sets, which there isn't very much there at the moment. But I do know many of the people are out there watching today, so I would encourage you maybe to say hello and ask some questions of Ed and I, and perhaps we can deal with them. Or if you want me to put any questions on to Greg, that would be really useful as well. Thank you. Hi, Ed.
Oh, good afternoon then. I think if there's no questions, then we could probably summarise. And there was a few important points that came out there about the cost of a fatality and the link with, say, previous presentations this morning when at that time it was 13.9 million per equivalent fatality. And we just see now from Nick's presentation how much investment went into Network Rail as a result of Margam. And I think the values have slightly changed somewhat. But the warnings is probably the biggest message. When there's a public inquiry, they're very good at, as a RAIB, finding out the documentary trail where people knew. And as we know we cannot not know information that we have. And that's quite worrying. And even if we look at the Manchester inquiry now to the Manchester Arena, we'll see similar patterns developing where police, security and costs are already identified at the initial stages. And I suspect that if we look at the RAIB report and see the audits and finding out that information, it's probably a good exercise for all of us with our business continuity to look and see how strong we are and how well we could protect ourselves and our businesses.
Ed, on you go. Sorry, Ed. I was just saying we've got a couple of questions coming in, and between us we'll see what we can do. Given that this is from Catherine, given that corporate memory is seen to be in 10 years, and I agree with that, what methods can we use to prompt to remind operators and contractors, etc.? My personal view in that is that IOSH ourselves as the railway group can do such things as these, and I think RAIB does quite a good job with making comments in its own reports. Ed, can you add to that?
Yeah, I think, as I just mentioned, with the corporate memory is so easy to forget, but I think we don't need to go back to, back to rail accidents. If we just now look at what's happening with the Manchester Arena, and we'll see the same patterns, the same information. And I think, there's nothing wrong with using the vulnerabilities of these current inquiries, even though they're not related, to make people aware of just how far we have to go back. But the investigators don't seem to have any trouble in finding this corporate memory issues. In most, I've done an investigation 1 year after another, exactly 1 year later, to the same accident almost, to the word, to the letter, and the lessons hadn't been learned. So I think it is a concern.
Rick makes a very good point, and this hits home to things that I'm worried about as well. Does the future hold automation, remove the human error perhaps? Thoughts on the potential for AI error? Now, I know the industry in areas that is looking at cyber security. It's look at I've lost the word there. The software, the interfaces between software and the hardware, and how can we validate and verify what's going on there. And I know I don't have the knowledge to interrogate software, and I'm very reliant on other experts. And I do think you've got a very good point. Ed, can you think of anything to add there?
I certainly can. I think if we can get George's presentation from yesterday, it certainly opened my eyes to the cyber issues as well as the IT issues, and his examples of the reliance on technology and the complications that we can't close our eyes to moving forward, but we certainly have to be much more aware. And it was very interesting from an engineering perspective how they got to the technology side and how they had to make sure everything was done properly. And referred to the Boeing Max disasters and what's happened there as a good example. Again, it's we don't have to stick to rail to find out these examples where technology didn't do what it was meant to do.
I do think there's a reflection on the incident that Greg has just covered us by, because we've got now new technologies and new change management challenges coming into place now, which is, in my mind, it's the same but different in teenager speak. So we have got software, we have the interfaces, there's a lot more electrification taking place. I think that the change management processes are critical here.
Just seeing a question from Amanda about talk a couple of years ago of RAIB sharing their reports, investigations, recommendations with the Air Accidents Investigation Board. Did it happen? Have we shared best practices between these? Amanda, I can't answer the question. I don't know, but I certainly myself use RAIB reports as part of my investigations. I also use the MAIB, the Maritime Accident Investigation Board reports, because I find them just so clear and easy to read. But it's a question I can put down to Simon to ask about that, and I'll get back to you if I can get your email afterwards.
Yeah, I'm jumping between the chats and the Q&A here to try and keep up. I think Ed and I have experienced that in the past now.
Yeah.
I see there's a few of my Irish colleagues on today. Do they have anything to add? And James has put a question forward to us now. So thank you, James. I find the cross-read explanation interesting. How much reliance can be given to the causation, presuming that the preceding signals were stepping correctly? Do you think jumping on the bandwagon disproportionately affects the data once the precedent is set? I'm going to have to read that again, but Ed, I'm fobbing off to you here.
Yeah, I think I've had a very similar experience of that. I'm not quite sure I can follow what the cross-read explanation is. Interesting. How much reliance can be placed to the causation of presuming that preceding signals were stepping correctly? Do you think jumping on the bandwagon?
Is this something to do with, James, if you could reword your question, that would be really useful. But I do understand that drivers get conditioned on the approach, and then there's cross-reading these signals. Is that sort of not reading the signal in front of them and reading an adjacent signal? It's a bit like read-through. So the driver's getting conditioned to expect what he's seeing and then seeing a signal to suit, which is not necessarily his signal.
I think we'll have to wait for a clarification on that, Russell. But I think, making an assumption what we're expecting at the next signal is obviously quite an issue. Are there any more questions? We're now back on both screens. We're getting them from both sides on the questions and the chat. I think I get interesting about the AI issue. Again, coming up, there's AI and the benefits or issues with that. Again, were mentioned by a question to Simon this morning in his presentation. And also, I think George's presentation really answers quite a few of these issues on automation, electrification, and the digital railway. I've just got some warnings about this particular investigation. They were significant, they were widespread, and the lessons weren't learned. And I think, this is probably the corporate memory again. And it doesn't even take too long when you've had so few or so many SPADs and reports in a short time. I don't think that can excuse a corporate memory. That is probably one of culture.
I'm looking at both sets.
Okay. James's point is trying to get us is the driver, once asked to explain post-SPAD, a preceding excuse is handy to use.
Oh, see that now.
I think yes, it could well be, but I think that's when you come down to system failure, because in this case, when they had so many reports before that and actual SPADs, I think once you see this problem occurring, it certainly isn't. It certainly can be used as an excuse, but if the matter had been addressed in the first place, that excuse wouldn't be needed. So we're coming down to not only human factors, but system failures, again, as mentioned in some of our previous presentations, James. I hope that's of some help.
I think if we're using evidence-based, going back to what Simon French says, you've got to look at it holistically and take everything into how all the interreactions are, and come to as close to the version of the absolute truth as we can to as investigators and as occupational safety and health experts. So, yeah, preceding excuse is handy, but the evidence should support what actually happened.
I think a good read of the RAIB report into Margam that's just come out would probably answer that question, that yes, there was lots of, let's say, custom and practice going on, but you keep doing the why, and when Simon explains how, many years ago that report may have ended that something was wrong in, the behaviour, now it goes down a lot deeper, and that investigation certainly does that. And I'd really commend a read of that report in as much detail as you can, and particularly the appendices as well, that gives all the warnings that their own auditors had found that there was a problem. So, you can't put it down to just one factor. It's fairly wide-ranging and in-depth investigation that you can find there. Are there any more questions? I think if not, I think we'd like to apologise for the sound issues that we had on the pre-recording, and it's something that we will look into later. But before we bring to close our first virtual rail conference, thank you for the questions that you've asked to myself and Russell. And I'd like to thank the IOSH Group Committee for organising this programme, and the technical team at IOSH for supporting us through the webinars. I'm sure the outtakes will follow, including Nick Millington, who abandoned his presentation after locking his wife outside. And you wouldn't have seen my panic as I locked myself out of the webinar about 2 minutes before my introduction. So I'm sure we'll learn as we improve to manage the technology. But as Russell mentioned, I'd like to offer our appreciation to our presenters. We couldn't have done this without them. Ian Prosser discussing the wide range of issues facing health and safety in the industry before. Anne Mills talked about the strategy, which involves many safety groups in RSSB, which means that everything and the collaboration that we're putting into it as an industry. So Nick's task as the director at Network Rail was unenviable. He had to explain, and there was lots of question, what Network Rail was doing to reduce the risk of track workers, and it was certainly a significant program. And as we've mentioned in this one, George Bearfield opened our eyes, certainly mine anyway, to digital and cyber risk in the future of a digital railway, and that has tied quite well in with the last presentation. And Simon's presentation reflected on lessons learned and learned for the future. If only we could, and we could put Simon out of work probably. I did say look out for Simon's investigation workshop that he has been holding annually. I can certainly recommend it. So finally, we have the rail industry's own narrator, Greg Morse. He took us on a journey and reminded us of the failings and hopefully learnings from Ladbroke Grove. So thank you all for supporting and attending our first seminar, your questions and feedback. And if there's anything that you would like the Rail Group to do to support you, please get in touch with us, and we will try and respond accordingly. Even if you're not a member of the group, let's hope you can join us. So let's learn, not only by minding the gaps, but hopefully closing them. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for myself. I'll try and do better next time. It's the first time I've done a video conference. It's all new to me. We're all learning. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.